I myself feel a hesitancy to even make a video about this, but for that very reason, I'm going to do it.
In times of hysteria, in some ways, I wish I would have even spoken out even more. The Overton window has moved dramatically where now this is an acceptable, a little bit boundary pushing, but somewhat acceptable conversation to have.
But you shouldn't have these conversations because whether or not they're acceptable. It should be in the pursuit of truth.
It's very important to explode narratives like the one that you were talking about, because those narratives live on in our memory as sort of flashpoints that people draw upon as evidence of narratives that are false.
I don't think people quite understand how powerful a story can be. There's little in this world that is more powerful than a well-told, engaging story.
Now, the reality of this particular death is now known, and we know pretty much everything there is to know about it.
When a story gets so solidified in our minds, can we adjust it to reflect truth if new data is introduced?
The reason why we now know all of this is because we know from jurors that they were pressured, that they felt the pressure, that they were scared to rule in favor of Derek Chauvin.
It would have been impossible for the jury not to be influenced by what was happening in the streets and public sentiment. I think we can observe that logical reality.
Then you start to look more into the details of the actual death of George Floyd. Everything from the autopsy report, the original medical examiner autopsy report suggested that he had died, not of failure to breathe because of pressure put on him, but effectively of excited delirium, fentanyl overdose. The idea in the actual autopsy report suggested that he had enough fentanyl in him that if he had just found this body on a sidewalk, the medical examiner, then he would have immediately determined that he had died of a fentanyl overdose.
Many people are going to push back and say, yeah, but you have the video. How can you kneel on someone's neck for that many minutes?
I was like everybody else when I first saw that tape. I think everybody, when they first saw the tape, they said, this is ugly, right? It looks ugly, because it turns out a lot of police procedure actually looks quite ugly. There are sections of the tape that people thought they saw, the 8 minutes or 4 minutes of the 8-minute tape. And then there was a lot of tape before that. Immediately upon entering the car, he starts shouting that he can't breathe before he's on the ground.
If we have video of that, we can observe that that is a fact. He was having difficulty breathing before being placed upon the ground. Again, it doesn't justify.
Suggesting that he was already having difficulty breathing based on the fact that he had a very enlarged heart, that he had a lot of drugs in his system, and that he was actually having a medical issue before he was actually taken out of the car, by the way, at his request.
We do know that that is true because that is on video. He did request to be taken out of the car. The other side's going to push back and say, okay, but there's still a contributing factor of the knee upon the neck.
He said, I don't want to be in the car. And so they said, okay, so they took him out of the car and they put him in prone position on the ground. Now, the Minneapolis police training model includes the sort of position that Derek Chauvin was using. This was introduced at trial.
It's a valid question. If it's true that he was following standard procedure and these other points are true, there should be accountability around the training.
Derek Chauvin had been taught this by the Minneapolis Police Department. This is a normal procedure. In fact, much of the tape of him on George Floyd's quote unquote neck from a different angle is him on George Floyd's shoulder. This was admitted by witnesses for the prosecution that some of that time he was on George Floyd's shoulder. Now, at some point during that 8 minutes, George Floyd went non-responsive.
Notice the language that he uses here. Derek Chauvin doesn't know at what point he went unresponsive, and that's the problem. Because if a suspect goes unresponsive while under your custody, which is under your care, it's your responsibility to detect that they have gone unresponsive so that you can respond medically. Does that warrant second-degree murder, though? He can have that duty, but he's not responsible for second-degree murder.
It seems to be unclear to Chauvin when he was non-responsive, but there is no medical evidence that, for example, there was damage to his trachea, which would cut off the air.
The logic here would indicate that it was about Derek Chauvin's direct contact with the suspect, not the lack of monitoring. Because if it was about the lack of monitoring, the other officers would be equally accountable.
George Floyd. You brought up George Floyd earlier.
I have a clip of Sean Ryan talking about this from years ago.
Right? Now, what did we do? We took that cop and threw his ass in fucking jail. And don't get me wrong, what he did is fucked up. I don't give a shit. But where's the fucking accountability?
He makes that same observation about the accountability.
What the fuck happened to the chief of police there? What the fuck happened to his supervisor? What the fuck happened to the mayor who's not on top of the fucking police department there? Nothing.
That is the point where I see conflict that could potentially lead to manslaughter.
So the autopsy and medical report suggested again that at best, there is certainly reasonable doubt that he died because of the suppression technique specifically that Derek Chauvin was using.
In order to be convicted of murder, it should be beyond a reasonable doubt. We all are aware of that. Is there reasonable doubt here? I could understand it if it was about neglecting your responsibility to monitor the suspects in your care.
And so the entire trial was based on the supposition that simply by being put into the prone position, and then Derek Chauvin being on his shoulder and then partially, not with his full weight, partially on his neck to suppress him, that this led to George Floyd's death in the form of murder, not even in the form of manslaughter, not even accidental death. Second-degree murder is what he was convicted of in state court. Okay, the evidence does not match up with this.
And when people claim, oh, Ben Shapiro is pretending to be a legal expert, look, contend with the logic and not the person.
There was only one major autopsy that was a complete documented autopsy of George Floyd. And it was performed, as you say, by the Hennepin County medical examiner, a guy named Dr. Andrew Baker. It was performed about 12 hours after he died. And that autopsy found zero evidence of asphyxia. It found no life-threatening injuries. It found instead that Floyd died of cardiopulmonary arrest, meaning his heart and his lungs stopped working during, quote, law enforcement subdual restraint and neck compression.
Many are making the case, well, that Trump can't do anything. He cannot pardon him because these were not federal charges. Even if Trump were to pardon the federal charges, Derek Chauvin would still be in prison for the state charges, therefore. Okay, but all that aside, I'm trying to examine the logic of, is there a foundation to make the case that he is wrongly imprisoned on the wrong charge?
Also, he had a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl in his blood, 11 milligrams per milliliter, along with a small amount of meth, as well as morphine.
So, yep, I think we can all agree that that's a lot of drugs, morphine, fentanyl, and meth.
The second autopsy that was created was paid for by Floyd's family. It was incomplete. They didn't have access to Floyd's toxicology report. They didn't have access to his tissue samples. They didn't have access to his organs, at least some of his organs. And one of the two medical examiners who's brought in, Dr. Michael Bodden, who's brought in to suggest that it was the cops who actually killed him.
Seems like the medical examiner should be an impartial examiner, like providing impartial findings. They shouldn't be brought in to prove a story is true. It should be, what are the facts, and then we deduce the truth from those facts.
The reality of this particular death is now known, and we know pretty much everything there is to know about it. And there are a bunch of reasons why Derek Chauvin should be pardoned. By the way, while in federal custody, he was stabbed recently 21 times by a fellow inmate, so it's quite dangerous.
Shapiro bringing this up, there have been people on the right talking about how, well, this would not be a good move politically for Trump, therefore Shapiro must be on the take. Trump shouldn't do this. It wouldn't be politically expedient.
There is absolutely nothing beneficial that pardoning Chauvin would do for the Trump administration, for this country, for race relations, for anybody else. It is absolutely destructive. It makes no sense.
And imagine you were the person in prison and you saw the outside world saying, well, it wouldn't be convenient for the president, so.
Guilt, innocent or not, you free Derek Chauvin today. What does this weekend look like in the country? The country is going to be set on fire, and who's the president? Donald Trump.
That's not what justice is supposed to be. It's not a matter of how popular it is. You would do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it's a good political move. I'm curious to see what the comments are on this video and what the response is to this, because I do not feel like anything I'm saying is controversial. I feel like all of this should be stuff that we can agree upon.